Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, Google announces a new premium subscription offering for their Google Chrome Enterprise Edition browser. Also, a roundup of this month's Patch Tuesday news, and a German state is migrating away from Windows desktops in favor of Linux desktops. For this and more, keep listening to the podcast. And as always, it's brought to you by my sponsors, and that includes Network's Policy Pack, where you use Group Policy, Policy Pack Cloud, or MDM to remove local admin rights, manage and lock down applications, Java, browsers, and mitigate ransomware, plus more. And also brought to you by ControlUp, end-to-end digital experience management for the work from anywhere era. ControlUp. Happy users, happy IT. And of course, it's also brought to you by Numescent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. It was Patch Tuesday this week, and Microsoft announced that they have patched 150 flaws, which includes 67 remote code execution bugs. This is a particularly large amount of flaws fixed this month. On the podcast, I had been mentioning that it seemed like fewer patches were being released for a few months now. I'm starting around close to the holidays, so this is a return to form after some time. And the flaws that are fixed this month, it includes 31 elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, 29 security feature bypass vulnerabilities, 67 remote code execution vulnerabilities that I already mentioned, 13 information disclosure vulnerabilities, 7 denial of service vulnerabilities, and 3 spoofing vulnerabilities. 3 of the vulnerabilities patched this month are deemed critical, and 2 are considered zero-day vulnerabilities that some other security firms have indicated are being actively exploited in the wild. According to BleepingComputer.com, the 0 days are CVE-2024-26234, which is a proxy driver spoofing vulnerability. This is an instance of a malicious driver that was signed with a valid Microsoft hardware publisher certificate, and the driver has been used to deploy a backdoor previously disclosed by Stairwell. It would be interesting to see if more information is shared around this vulnerability. It seems like they were late to actually publish the CVE related to this particular zero-day vulnerability, but the fact that it's a signed certificate and the fact that Microsoft's cert signing was infiltrated a few months ago, I wonder if that's connected and it's actually been signed with a Microsoft cert. Possibly, just speculating, nothing confirmed at this time, but I wonder if there'll be more information on this one going forward. But the other zero-day vulnerability is CVE-2024-29988, and this is a smart screen prompt security feature bypass vulnerability. This allows attachments to bypass Microsoft Defender smart screen prompts when the file is opened. And this was used by financially motivated Water Hydra hacking group to target Forex trading forums and stock trading Telegram channels. And a heads up about CVE-2024-23593, which is a zero-out boot manager and drop to UEFI, the UEFI shell, where an attacker who successfully exploits this vulnerability could bypass secure boot, which is obviously a major problem, especially, they're selling the virtues of secure boot and how it's required for Windows 11 now. But the real downside of this is it requires more intervention than just deploying an update. Protections are not enabled by default. There's further steps that have to be taken, which you may see in the YouTube recording of this video in front of you. I won't go through all of it because it's a little extensive, but be sure to check out the links with this episode for more information on what you have to do to fully protect yourself against that particular vulnerability as well. BleepingComputer.com also got into some other backlogged SharePoint zero-day vulnerabilities, which are being exploited but have not yet been assigned CVEs. If you'd like to read about those for yourself, you could check out a link that I'll share with this episode, which is episode 329, and you'll find that over at 5bytespodcast.com. And as always, other vendors have also released their own patches to align with Patch Tuesday, such as like Ivanti, Adobe, and more. During Google's Cloud Next conference in Las Vegas this week, Google launched their Chrome Enterprise Premium offering. It's reported that Chrome Enterprise Premium will cost $6 per user per month, and it mostly extends the security capabilities of their existing service with new features including additional enterprise controls to enforce policies, manage software updates and extensions, as well as new security reporting features and forensic capabilities that can be integrated with third-party security tools. Chrome Enterprise Premium takes Zero Trust a step further, according to a report by TechCrunch.com, with context aware access controls that can also mitigate risk of data leaks. And this includes approved applications and those that were not sanctioned by an IT department. TechCrunch.com featured a quote from Nick Reva, who's head of corporate security engineering at Snap, which went, quote, "With Chrome Enterprise Premium, we have confidence in Google's security expertise, including Project Zero's cutting-edge security research and fast security patches. We set up data loss prevention restrictions and warnings for sharing sensitive information in applications like generative AI platforms and noticed a noteworthy 50% reduction in content transfers." End quote. So certainly in that customer use case, they're leaning into this idea of reducing content transfers when users begin to leverage these generative AI platforms like ChatGPT. So, I mean, that's certainly a selling point, I guess. And I just find this interesting as secure browsers are on the rise, with Island.io getting a valuation in the billions recently, and Parallels announcing their own secure browser offering to compete with the likes of Citrix's secure browser and more. In the press release, Google touches on how the browser is becoming even more relied on as more applications move to web based SaaS, and highlighted that even some developers are now coding within the browser. So browsers are becoming an even bigger target, but this reads like an extension of the Chrome browser security features rather than delivering a Chrome containerized browser that's native from Google. I wonder if Google will eventually pivot to a containerized browser offering. It certainly seems like there's a lot of money on the table if they decide to go that way. BleepyComputer.com reports that Microsoft is now using a Windows driver to prevent users from changing the configured Windows 10 and Windows 11 default browser through software or by manually modifying the registry. Now, it's worth noting that in the same article by BleepyComputer.com, their findings was that it's not being restricted in the same way on Windows 11, but certainly is the case on Windows 10, which is going to be the most common OS at the moment in enterprise. So it's definitely worth noting for sure. And Windows users can still change their default browser through the Windows setting. So if you go to the settings application in Windows and go to the default programs, you're able to change it there. However, those who utilize software to make the changes may now find themselves blocked. It has been noted by several in the community that you can disable the driver that is blocking modification of those registry values to return to the solution that you've been using to manage those default browser settings. And Christoph Kolbix, who created Set User FTA, stated on Twitter, quote, "We cannot simply unload this driver, but we can, of course, disable it. And this can be done by a one-liner in an elevated PowerShell followed by a reboot." And I'm not going to read out the commandlet. It's a little bit long, but I'll share that commandlet with you in this episode. So if you're listening to the audio only, if you check out the YouTube edition, you'll see it in the video. Otherwise, I'll share a link with this episode, which is again episode 329, and you can find that at 5bytespodcast.com to get that PowerShell commandlet for yourself. That will then require a reboot in order to disable that driver to allow you to continue to manage the default browser the way you have been doing. It is speculated that the change was made by Microsoft with the February updates in order to comply with Europe's Digital Markets Act, which aims to ensure fair competition and the prevention of anti-competitive practices by the large companies known as the gatekeepers. I'm not so sure about that myself, to be honest. It seems like a strange way of implementing this, and if anything, I would think it would make it more difficult to move to an alternative browser. But hey, what do I know? Show sponsor Network's Policy Pack have indicated that their browser-to-browser routing and file associations for everything except PDF will continue to work. However, browser router won't be registered as Policy Pack browser router agent within the OS. You'll still see Edge. The browser router default policy type is not honored as expected, and anything set to default browser will be passed onward to Edge instead of what you may have it set to, like, say, Firefox or Chrome. Also, delivering file association specifically for PDF for Policy Pack File Association Manager may not work. Luckily, the team at Policy Pack have published a KB article that has a comprehensive guide on how to work around this change to get the functionality you want. And to be honest, you should want to use something like Set User FTA or Policy Pack for managing your default browser and FTA settings, because the option that Microsoft is now trying to force users to rely on in the default program settings in the Windows setting menu can be infuriating. I really dislike it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And thanks to my buddy Jeremy for tagging me on the article and providing more context. Reuters have reported that global shipments of personal computers returned to growth in the first quarter after 2 years of decline. This is according to market research by IDC, which is the International Data Corporation, that was released on Monday. The PC market grew 1.5% from a year earlier, with 59.8 million shipments in the first quarter, and returned to pre-pandemic levels with the onset of a refresh cycle for PCs that were purchased during the pandemic. So, I mean, this was bound to happen in that regard because there are refresh cycles within organizations. So, of course. Lenovo Group topped the list again in terms of manufacturers with 23% market share, followed by HP and Dell, attaining market share of about 20% and 15.5% respectively. Apple saw a 14.6% rise in shipments in the quarter and had a market share of 8.1%. And all of this is despite continuing challenges in the Chinese market. As you may recall, China's supply chains were disrupted longer than most countries as they kept rolling lockdowns in place for longer in trying to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. I wonder, since these hardware refreshes are taking place now, and obviously the Windows 10 end of support is looming for 2025, I'm sure organizations must be looking at Windows 11, and there may be some that are required to actually upgrade their hardware in order to be compatible with the Windows 11, or at least to run Windows 11 optimally, considering how damn resource intensive Windows applications have been becoming. So yeah, I think this was going to be inevitable this year, but I wonder how supply chain constraints may be affecting those who are trying to do a hardware refresh. Perhaps this number is lower than it possibly could be, considering so many components are still being manufactured in China. It would be interesting to see how this year goes and how much adoption of Windows 11 takes place, and whether or not enterprises will be delayed due to continuing supply constraints. BleepyComputer.com has reported on Windows 11 24H2, which they suggest will be coming out in autumn of this year. And it will bring with it the consolidated single Teams app that I reported on in a previous episode of the podcast. It will bring more native abilities for Copilot, like the ability to diagnose audio issues, Windows Update service issues, help with adjusting volume, launching applications, managing your startup applications, and more. Also, sudo for Windows, which is something else I reported on this podcast, will be included in this release. Plus, much more. If you'd like to read about what else is going to be featured in this Windows 11 24H2 release, I'll share a link with this episode so you can read about it. Schleswig-Holstein, which is one of Germany's 16 states, has confirmed its plans to move tens of thousands of their systems from Microsoft Windows to Linux. This comes after a pilot of using LibreOffice rather than Microsoft Office over a 2-year period. Interestingly, they've stated they may use software so specialized that they won't be able to move to open source software, which seems like a little bit of a cop-out, and I wonder if they're going to be using something like Citrix for publishing some Windows applications in order to have Windows applications running on those Linux desktops still. Is that a little bit of a caveat? Well, regardless, they intend to move to Linux desktops as their client side, so that's interesting. They've also suggested that if they were to move to Windows 11, they would face challenges due to incompatible hardware. Ars Technica reports they will ditch Microsoft SharePoint and Exchange and Outlook in favor of open source offerings such as Nextcloud and OpenExchange and Mozilla Thunderbird in conjunction with the Univention Active Directory connector. On this podcast several years ago, I covered the fact Munich in Germany moved to Linux, but they ultimately moved back to Windows. And regarding that fact, Ars Technica did have a piece about that, suggesting that the main problem there was that employees weren't sufficiently involved in the move. And to combat that problem, they're planning on a longer transition phase with parallel use of Windows and Linux. And they are introducing open source step by step where the departments are ready for it. This will also create reason for further rollouts because people see that it works, in their opinion, which remains to be seen if it does work, so it'll be interesting to keep an eye on this. And honestly, I've been critical of many of Microsoft's anti-competitive practices, particularly over the last couple of years, and I also feel concerned that we are diving headlong into having little choice when it comes to end-user computing products, and that could end up stifling innovation and leave us all captive to Microsoft's whims for pricing and support policies. But even so, I can't see a migration to Linux desktops working out too well, at least not one that goes all in on native Linux desktops right away with no alternatives. It sounds like, even though the headline here is, hey, we're moving to Linux desktops and we're moving away from these Microsoft products to these open source alternatives, they intend to do it little by little, and it seems like they're going to have Windows applications in their back pocket still to run parallel. And maybe in a few years, if more applications become truly browser based, it may work out. But even then, I've seen vendors of SaaS web based apps requiring integration with SharePoint Online for document repositories and not supporting those open source alternatives like OpenOffice or LibreOffice. So, again, yeah, that would be a move to a web-based application instead of a Win32 application in that case, but you're still being tied back to a Microsoft product for that kind of back-end integration that's required. I've also worked with products that became browser-based, but ended up still requiring many files being delivered and managed onto the user's devices for that browser app to work. So in essence, yeah, the front end and the UI that the users were interacting with was in the browser, but the application's files were still locally installed. So it kind of negates some of the benefit, at least from a management and an IT admin perspective. But if there was a move to like purely browser-based applications that didn't need any files or any other components that might be tied to a certain operating system over another one, then hey, maybe a Linux desktop in the future may make sense because most users will only rely on a browser, but that remains to be seen and it could be several years off. Best of luck to Schleswig-Holstein. It would be interesting to keep tabs on this. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is warning that hackers are now using social engineering tactics to target IT help desks across the healthcare and public health sector. In the attacks, threat actors use a local area code to call organizations pretending to be employees in the financial department and provide stolen ID verification details, including corporate ID and social security numbers. BleepingComputer.com reports the attackers use this sensitive information and claim their smartphone is broken and convince the IT help desk to enroll a new device in MFA that is under the attacker's control. The department suggests to block attacks targeting their IT help desks, organizations in the health sector are advised to require callbacks to verify employees requesting password resets in new MFA devices, monitor for suspicious ACH changes, revalidate all users with access to payer websites, consider in-person requests for sensitive matters, require supervisors to verify requests, and train help desk staff to identify and report social engineering techniques and verify callers' identities. So if you're working in healthcare, be vigilant. As always. We're already over 20 minutes into this episode of the podcast, so in the interest of time, let's cover some quick hit stories. First, Ivanti CEO has promised a new era and one that fundamentally transforms the Ivanti security operating model backed by a significant investment and full board support. In a published statement, he highlighted new capabilities, including some that are powered by AI, which I kind of roll my eyes to that because, just in my opinion, it seems a little weak to mention that, as so many vendors are currently screaming AI features from a megaphone and trying to jump on that bandwagon. And when your company's reputation in terms of security has been harmed so much by so many vulnerabilities over the last few months, I think it's better not to lean onto kind of these buzz terms, and you'd be better served just focusing on assurances from an organizational standpoint. It doesn't help that the statement was also published just as more security vulnerabilities have been disclosed in Connect Secure and Policy Secure Gateway products by Ivanti, and two of them have been rated with high severity. I hope they can turn it around, however, but it is going to be a very steep hill to climb as their reputation did take on a lot of damage in the last few months. Late last week, reports surfaced that after installing the January 2024 non-security update KB503-4203 or later, that some Windows devices which use DHCP option 235 for discovery of Microsoft Connected Cache or MCC in their network might be unable to use the MCC nodes that are discovered. And if you're impacted by this, there is a workaround available, and I'll share a link with this episode for information on that. Reports of cyber attacks on companies like Omni Hotels and Panera in the US are being tied to attack campaigns that are targeting VMware ESXi servers. In one of the associated attacks, the threat actors known as ESXi, as in ESXi with a lowercase I and an uppercase SEX, clever, demanded 2 bitcoins per customer to receive a decryptor. Obviously, it is critical to keep your ESXi hosts up to date, but it is a bit of a pain in the arse to update vCenter and ESXi hosts. It can be quite time consuming to complete that work, but regardless, it is of critical importance, and this is exactly why they are being targeted, and VMware products such as ESXi and vCenter get targeted routinely, so keep on top of those patches. Notepad++ have requested help from the community to report an imposter site acting as a redirect in order to download Notepad++. If you have the time and wish to help, report notepad.plus, which is the site URL, which shows up high in the search results when you search for download Notepad++. So if you want to take a few moments out of your day to help Notepad++, which is an awesome product that is freely available to everyone, give that a go. Well, it's that time of year again. The DaaS Like a Pro survey is now open. I strongly encourage everyone who's listening to this episode to please check out the survey and answer it. It only takes a few minutes, and you might think, well, what do I get out of this? Well, it's about what we as a community get collectively out of this, which is the data helps us detect trends over the years. So like the survey has been published and shared in previous years too. So you could see what technologies are emerging, just the way the wind is blowing. You know, our organizations considering a move to DaaS, our organizations may be moving back more towards on-premises. It really helps out everyone by having this data, and you can do your part by filling in the survey. And of course, I'll share a link so you can fill out that survey with this episode, which is episode 329, and you'll find that at 5bytespodcast.com. But now this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. First up this week, Julian Morin tweeted, anyone who is using HashiCorp Packer with the Azure ARM provider and doing a domain join, well, this will break the WinRM connection. Afterwards, the local Packer user account always tries to authenticate to the domain packer@contoso.com. So obviously that is a big problem because WinRM is pretty heavily relied on now. Finally, Niels Koch has a blog post on running Windows Defender for Server in passive mode, which was inspired by his work with a client who did not wish to use Defender as their primary security solution. So if you're managing Windows servers and you're maybe using a different security product, possibly like Sophos or something like that, and you'd want to run Defender in a passive mode, this is a pretty comprehensive, great blog post for you to follow. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Next week's episode is probably going to come out earlier in the week because I have to travel for EUC Unplugged. And hey, if you're going to EUC Unplugged, I will see you there. And be sure to check out next week's episode. And thank you so much for listening.